The divorce papers were already signed before Clara ever entered the room. She found out the way most wives of powerful men found out about the worst moment of their lives. Not from her husband, but from a servant, a young housemaid, pale-faced and trembling, had pressed a folded note into her hand outside the breakfast room. Clara had read it twice, then a third time. Then she had walked very quietly to the study where Duke Ashford stood behind his mahogany desk with his back to the door, hands clasped, staring out across the frost-bitten grounds of Ashford Hall, as though he had already made peace with what he was doing. "Tell me," Clara said, "that this is someone else's signature." He turned slowly. There was no guilt in his expression, no apology forming at the edges of his mouth, just a cool, composed face of a man who had already moved the pieces and was simply waiting for the board to clear. "You knew this arrangement was never permanent," he said. "I knew no such thing." Her voice did not shake. She would not allow it. "Lord Pembroke's daughter," he continued, as if she hadn't spoken, "brings connections I cannot afford to refuse. The northern estates, the parliamentary seat. You understand how these things work, Clara." She looked at him for a long moment, this man she had given 6 years of her life to, and understood with perfect clarity that she had never truly known him at all. What she did not yet know was that Duke Ashford had made a devastating miscalculation, and it would cost him everything. 6 years earlier, Clara Hastings had arrived at Ashford Hall with little more than a modest dowry, an honest name, and the quiet intelligence that her mother had always warned her to conceal around powerful men. She had not concealed it. That perhaps had been her first mistake, or so society had whispered. But Duke Ashford had seemed, in those early years, to value it. He had asked for her opinion on estate matters. He had listened, or appeared to listen, when she spoke at dinner about the tenants, about the harvest yields, about the slow deterioration of the eastern cottages where families were raising children in leaking rooms. She had repaired those cottages herself, redirected household funds with careful, quiet efficiency, drafted proposals, negotiated with builders when the Duke was occupied in London. The tenants had adored her. The staff had trusted her. Even Lady Whitmore, the sharp-tongued widow who presided over the county's social calendar like a general commanding troops, had once remarked that Clara Hastings was the finest thing to happen to the Ashford estate in a generation. The Duke had smiled when he heard that. Clara had believed the smile was pride. Now, standing in the cold corridor outside the study with the divorce papers folded in her hand, she understood that the smile had been something far more transactional. She had been useful, and now she was inconvenient. She did not weep. Not then. She moved through the rest of that morning with the measured composure of someone navigating a collapse that had not yet fully arrived, instructing the housekeeper, reviewing correspondence, sitting through luncheon with the rigid stillness of a woman keeping herself intact by sheer discipline. It was only later, in the privacy of her dressing room, that she allowed herself to sit down on the edge of the chair and breathe. Her reflection in the mirror looked back at her, 31 years old, brown-eyed, steady, not ruined, not finished, simply standing at the edge of something she had not chosen and could not yet see the bottom of. One thought surfaced through everything else, calm and precise as a blade. He thinks he has discarded a quiet wife. He does not know what he has discarded. Outside her window, the first snow of winter had begun to fall on Ashford Hall. Somewhere in London, Lord Pembroke was already celebrating an alliance he believed was secured. Neither man had thought to ask what Clara Hastings intended to do next. Clara left Ashford Hall on a Tuesday morning with 2 trunks, her lady's maid, and a leather satchel that never left her hands. The Duke had offered her a settlement, modest, carefully calculated to be just generous enough that she could not publicly complain about it, and just insufficient enough to ensure she remained dependent on the goodwill of whatever household might take her in. It was the kind of settlement designed by a man who understood money as a weapon. Clara had accepted it without argument. That, too, seemed to unsettle him slightly, the absence of tears, of pleading, of the scene he had likely prepared himself for. She had signed the documents, thanked the solicitor with genuine courtesy, and walked out through the front doors of Ashford Hall, without looking back once. She went to her aunt's townhouse in Bath. Small, slightly worn at the edges, but warm. Her aunt, Mrs. Elspeth Carr, was a widow of modest means and enormous perception, and she asked only one question when Clara arrived on her doorstep. "Did he deserve you?" "No," Clara said simply. But that is no longer the point. She spent the first week in Bath doing what everyone expected her to do, resting, receiving sympathetic calls from acquaintances, deflecting questions with graceful vagueness. But in the evenings, after her aunt retired, Clara sat at the small writing desk by the window and worked. The leather satchel contained 6 years of careful observation, letters she had copied in her own hand before filing the originals, estate ledgers she had quietly memorized, and something far more significant, a series of financial records she had first noticed 18 months ago, when a discrepancy in the Eastern property accounts had led her, almost by accident, into the edge of something much darker. The numbers had never quite resolved. Funds moved between accounts in patterns that served no legitimate estate purpose. A name appeared repeatedly in the margins of transactions, not the Duke's name, but Lord Pembroke's. The same Lord Pembroke whose daughter was now positioned to become the next Duchess of Ashford. Clara had said nothing at the time. She had not been certain enough, and she had still, foolishly, believed in the man she had married. She was certain now. Something felt wrong about all of it, not merely the betrayal, but the timing, the urgency of the divorce, the speed of the Pembroke alliance, as though both men were moving toward something that needed to be secured before someone looked too closely. Clara looked closely, and on the 8th night in Bath by candlelight, she finally understood what she was looking at. That was the moment everything changed. The Ashford estate was not wealthy. It had not been wealthy for nearly 4 years. Clara sat with the evidence spread across the writing desk and read it the way a physician reads a patient's chart, without flinching, without looking away from what the numbers were saying. The Duke had been borrowing against the northern properties since before their 3rd year of marriage, quietly, through intermediaries, using instruments that were just obscure enough to evade casual scrutiny. The debts were not catastrophic on their own, but they were layered compounding, and they were tied in ways that took Clara 3 evenings to fully untangle, directly to Lord Pembroke. Pembroke had not simply offered his daughter's hand in a gesture of social alliance. He had bought the Duke. The marriage was a transaction. Pembroke would absorb the debts, consolidate the northern estates under his own influence, and use the Ashford title and its parliamentary connections as a vehicle for a land consolidation scheme that would dispossess dozens of tenant families across 3 counties. The very families Clara had spent 6 years protecting. She set down her pen and sat very still for a long moment. The divorce had not been about love or ambition, or even about Pembroke's daughter particularly. It had been about removing the one person inside the estate who kept precise, thorough records and had the intelligence to read them correctly. Clara had not been discarded because she was inconvenient to a marriage. She had been discarded because she was a threat. Duke Ashford had not traded her for a better alliance. He had sold her silence, or believed he had, as part of the price of his own financial rescue. Clara stood up from the desk and walked to the window. Bath was quiet at this hour, the street below silver with frost, a single lamplighter making a slow way along the road. She watched him until he disappeared around the corner, thinking with a particular clarity that arrives only after a great shock has fully settled. She thought about the tenant families. She thought about Mrs. Beale, the old widow in the Eastern cottage, whose roof Clara had personally arranged to have repaired. She thought about the children she had seen running across those grounds, and what it would mean for them if Pembroke's consolidation succeeded. Then she thought about Lady Whitmore, sharp-tongued, socially omnipotent, and Clara recalled with sudden precision a woman who had lost her own estate to a predatory land scheme 30 years ago and had never forgotten it. A woman who moved through England's aristocratic circles like a current moves through water, invisible until it pulls you under. Clara had always been careful to maintain that friendship, not out of calculation, but out of genuine respect. Tonight, for the first time, she allowed herself to consider that the friendship might be precisely what this moment required. She reached for a fresh sheet of paper and began to write, and that was when the truth began to surface. Lady Whitmore's response arrived in Bath within 4 days. Not a letter, a carriage. Clara recognized a Whitmore crest on the door panel before the vehicle had fully stopped, and something in her chest loosened fractionally. She had not realized, until that moment, how tightly she had been holding herself together. Lady Whitmore stepped out without waiting for assistance, moved up the front path with the purposeful energy of a woman 30 years younger, and was inside the parlor with her coat still on before Clara's aunt had finished pouring the tea. "Sit," Lady Whitmore said, to Clara, to Mrs. Carr, to the room in general. Then she read every document Clara had prepared, in complete silence, for 22 minutes. When she finished, She looked up. Pembroke, she said quietly, has done this before. Clara went still. Before? Not identically, but the pattern, the debt acquisition, the arranged marriage, the displacement of tenants through consolidation. He attempted something similar in Wiltshire 12 years ago. It was stopped, barely. The family involved was too ashamed to pursue it publicly and settled privately. She set the papers down with the deliberate care of someone handling something combustible. He has simply grown more sophisticated since then. The weight of that settled over the room, like weather. He believed I had taken nothing with me, Clara said. Men like Pembroke always underestimate the women they consider beneath them. Lady Whitmore's expression was not warm, exactly, but it carried something that felt like fierce solidarity. That is historically their most expensive habit. What followed was not a simple plan. It was a kind of careful, layered strategy that required patience, precise timing, and access to circles that Clara alone could not have reached. Lady Whitmore had spent 30 years cultivating exactly those circles, not out of vanity, but out of the quiet, steely understanding that influence, properly maintained, was the only reliable protection a woman of her era could construct for herself. She knew 3 members of the parliamentary committee that would need to approve Pembroke's land consolidation proposal. She knew their wives better still. She also knew a solicitor in London, discreet, principled, and possessed of a particular professional animosity toward Lord Pembroke dating back to a case he would never discuss publicly but had never stopped thinking about. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, the 3 women around the small parlor table, the tea going cold and forgotten. Clara's aunt said very little but listened to everything, and twice made observations so precisely correct that both Clara and Lady Whitmore stopped and looked at her with renewed attention. Outside, the winter deepened. Inside, something was being constructed with great care. But 3 days later, everything nearly collapsed. The letter came from Ashford Hall, but it had not been written by the Duke. It had been written by Mrs. Rowe, the housekeeper, a woman of 30 years' loyal service who had quietly adored Clara and quietly despised what the estate had become. The letter was short, and its message was precise. Lord Pembroke had discovered that Clara had removed documents before her departure. A trusted footman, one Clara had believed loyal, had spoken. Pembroke was moving faster than they had anticipated. The parliamentary submission for the land consolidation had been accelerated by 6 weeks, and Pembroke had engaged his own solicitor to pursue Clara directly, on the grounds that the documents she carried were estate property, their removal constituting a legal violation that could be used to discredit both her and anything she attempted to present. Clara read the letter at the breakfast table. She set it down. She picked up her tea. She put it down again without drinking. "He means to bury me before I can speak," she said. Lady Whitmore, seated across from her, did not offer false comfort. "Yes, he is not a stupid man, only a corrupt one." The solicitor they had engaged, Mr. Aldrich Fenn, precise and gray-haired and quietly formidable, arrived that same afternoon and confirmed what the letter had suggested. Pembroke's legal maneuver was not frivolous. If he could establish that the documents had been improperly removed, their evidentiary value collapsed entirely. And without the documents, what remained was the word of a divorced woman against 2 of England's most politically connected men. For the first time since Bath, Clara felt the cold edge of something that was not quite fear, but lived in the same neighborhood. She had built this carefully. She had been thorough, and it might still not be enough. That evening she sat alone in the small garden behind her aunt's house, despite the cold, and thought with painful honesty about what she stood to lose. Not just the case, but the tenants, the families, the widow in the eastern cottage. All of it resting on a legal technicality that Pembroke had identified with predatory precision. Then her aunt appeared at the garden door, holding a candle and wearing an expression Clara had never seen on her face before, something between urgency and carefully suppressed triumph. "Clara," Mrs. Carr said, "I believe you should come inside." She was holding a second letter, older than the one from Mrs. Rowe. The handwriting on the outside was unfamiliar, the seal already broken, the paper slightly yellowed at the edges. "This arrived for me," her aunt said carefully, 12 years ago, from a woman in Wiltshire. "I never knew quite what to do with it. Until now," Clara said. "Until now." The letter from Wiltshire changed everything. It had been written by a Mrs. Dorothea Sable, the wife of the family Pembroke had targeted 12 years prior, the case Lady Whitmore had referenced in the parlor. The family had settled privately, yes, but Dorothea Sable had not been a woman who trusted private settlements to hold forever. Before she died, 2 years after the ordeal, her health broken by the strain of it, she had written down everything: names, dates, the precise mechanism of Pembroke's scheme, documented in the steady, furious hand of a woman who wanted someone, someday, to know the truth. She had sent a copy to every person she thought might one day need it. Mrs. Elspeth Carr, a distant acquaintance, had received one, had filed it carefully, uncertainly, in the back of a correspondence drawer, had not known for 12 years that it was a weapon. Clara read it twice, standing in the parlor with a candle, throwing unsteady light across the pages, and understood that Dorothea Sable had, from beyond the grave, handed her exactly what Pembroke's legal maneuver had threatened to remove. The Wiltshire letter was not estate property. It could not be suppressed, and it established with documented precision that what Pembroke was attempting in 3 counties was not an isolated transaction, but a deliberate, repeated pattern of predatory acquisition. Mr. Fenn took the letter and the original documents together to London the following morning. What happened next moved with the swift, irreversible momentum of a stone released from height. The parliamentary committee reviewed the consolidated submission and found it procedurally irregular, accelerated without proper notice to affected tenant representatives, a technicality Mr. Fenn had identified and pressed with quiet, relentless efficiency. The submission was suspended pending full review. Lady Whitmore paid 3 calls in 2 days. She said very little at each one. She did not need to. The wives of powerful men have always understood one another across the surface of polite conversation, and what passed between them in those drawing rooms required no elaboration. Lord Pembroke withdrew the consolidation proposal entirely on a gray Thursday morning, issuing a brief statement citing changed financial circumstances. No one of consequence believed it. Everyone of consequence accepted it, because the alternative, a public examination of the Wiltshire precedent, was something Pembroke could not survive. Duke Ashford, stripped of Pembroke's financial backing and suddenly exposed to the full weight of his accumulated debts, was forced to begin selling the northern properties, not to Pembroke, to the tenants' cooperative that Clara had quietly helped establish through Mr. Fenn in the final weeks of the proceedings. Small parcels, fairly priced, legally secured. Mrs. Beale's cottage roof, Clara was informed, was in excellent condition. Spring arrived early that year. Clara was in the garden of her aunt's house in Bath when Mr. Fenn's final letter reached her, confirming the last of the legal proceedings closed. She read it in the morning light, then folded it carefully and set on the garden table beside her tea. Her aunt appeared at the door. "Well, it is finished," Clara said. Mrs. Carr studied her niece for a moment. The straight back, the quiet hands, the expression of a woman who had walked through considerable fire and come out the other side not hardened but clarified, as though the experience had burned away everything unnecessary and left only what was true. "And what will you do now?" her aunt asked. Clara looked out across the garden, where the first green of the season was pushing through the dark soil with the patient, unstoppable insistence of things that intend to grow. "Something worthwhile," she said, "on my own terms." Lady Whitmore, it emerged, had already anticipated this. A letter arrived that same afternoon proposing that Clara take formal oversight of a charitable trust Lady Whitmore was establishing, one dedicated specifically to securing legal protections for tenant families across the county. It required intelligence, organizational precision, and a thorough understanding of estate financial structures. It required, in other words, exactly Clara Hastings. She accepted by return post. Duke Ashford was seen once more, briefly, at a county function the following autumn. He looked older, quieter, the kind of man who has discovered, too late, the difference between what he discarded and what he deserved. He did not approach Clara. She did not seek him out. She was deep in conversation with 3 tenant representatives and a junior parliamentary aide when he arrived, and she did not notice him leave. Some losses announced themselves loudly. Others simply stand at the edge of a room and understand, without a word being spoken, exactly what they have cost themselves. What would you have done in her place? Spoken sooner, or waited until the moment was exactly right?